There exists, on the windswept plateau of eastern Anatolia, a city that once held 100,000 souls, rivaled the grandeur of Constantinople itself, and has been so thoroughly erased from collective memory that most people today have never heard its name. Stand today at the edge of the Arcurian River Gorge, and you will see them, walls of honey-colored stone rising from grass and wildflowers, arched doorways opening onto nothing, the skeletal remains of churches whose domes collapsed centuries ago. The wind moves through empty windows with a sound like distant voices, carrying with it the scent of wild thyme and dust older than empires. Birds nest in what were once bell towers, their songs the only music these vaulted spaces have known for half a millennium. The silence is profound, almost sacred, broken only by the occasional bleating of sheep grazing among ruins that were already ancient when the Ottoman sultans came to power. Across the gorge, barely a kilometer away, lies the closed border with Armenia. You can see the watchtowers on the opposite bank, the razor wire strung between posts, the no man's land where two nations refuse to meet. The city that once connected empires now sits in a geopolitical dead zone, accessible from one side only, claimed by competing narratives, remembered differently depending on who tells the story. The river Arcurian flows between them, indifferent to boundaries drawn on maps, carving its channel deeper year by year, exactly as it did when anise markets thrived with merchants from a dozen lands. This is not simply a tale of a city that fell and was forgotten. Forgetting requires active participation. What happened to Ani was not natural decay, not the inevitable entropy that claims all human works. It was systematic cultural erasure, conducted across centuries by successive empires, each finding something threatening in the memory of this place, each choosing suppression over preservation. The question that haunts the ruins is not how did this city fall, but why was its very existence deemed dangerous enough to methodically erase from history? To understand what was lost, we must first rebuild it in our minds. We must walk streets that no longer exist, hear languages that have not been spoken there for 800 years, smell spices from caravans that will never come again. We must see Ani not as ruin, but as it was, alive, cosmopolitan, thriving at the crossroads of the medieval world. Close your eyes and let the reconstruction begin. The year is 1010 in the Common Era. Europe languishes in what later historians will call the Dark Ages, though this term reveals more about European provincial thinking than about the actual state of global civilization. The Carolingian Empire has fragmented into squabbling feudal territories. Viking raids terrorize coastal settlements from Ireland to the Mediterranean. In England, Ethelred the Unready struggles against Danish invasions. In France, the Capetian dynasty has barely established itself. Feudalism locks populations into rigid hierarchies of obligation and survival, where peasants are born and die within a few kilometers of their birthplace, where literacy is the privilege of clergy, where the horizon of possibility extends no further than the next harvest. But here, at the intersection of the Silk Road's northern routes, a different world flourishes. Ani, capital of the Armenian Bagratid Kingdom, has become one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated urban centers on Earth. While London struggles to support 15,000 inhabitants, while Paris contains perhaps 20,000 souls living in timber houses along muddy streets, Ani teems with a cosmopolitan population that contemporary chroniclers estimate between 100,000 and 200,000 people. The exact number dissolves into the uncertainty that surrounds all medieval census data. But the archaeological evidence supports a city of extraordinary size and density for its era. The city spreads across a triangular plateau, protected on two sides by steep river gorges, and on the third by massive double walls punctuated with towers. These fortifications stretch for nearly 5 kilometers, built from blocks of volcanic tuff quarried from nearby deposits. The stone is porous, lightweight, easy to work with iron tools, yet remarkably durable. In the light of dawn, it appears pale gold. At midday, it blazes almost white. In the setting sun, it glows amber and rust, as if the walls themselves are burning. The fortifications are not merely defensive structures, but architectural statements, asserting Ani's permanence to anyone approaching from the western steppes. Pass through the Lion Gate, named for the carved felines that flank its entrance with mouths open in eternal roars, and you enter a metropolis that would astonish any traveler from Western Europe. The streets are paved with fitted stones, cambered for drainage. Underground channels carry waste away from residential districts. Aqueducts bring fresh water from springs in the surrounding hills, feeding public fountains where citizens fill clay vessels throughout the day. The water system is sophisticated enough that some merchant mansions feature interior courtyards with fountains, a luxury that announces wealth more effectively than any amount of gold. Public baths operate on principles of heating and plumbing that Rome would have recognized, but that contemporary London could not match. The hypocaust system circulates hot air beneath tiled floors. Separate chambers offer different temperatures. Men and women bathe at different hours, or in some larger establishments, in separate wings. The baths are social centers where business is conducted, gossip is exchanged, and the hierarchies of urban life are negotiated in an atmosphere thick with steam and the scent of olive oil soap. The population approaches 200,000 at its peak, though exact numbers dissolve into the uncertainty that surrounds all medieval census data. What matters is the density of human activity, the layered complexity of urban life. Walk through the commercial districts in mid-morning, and you are immersed in a cacophony of languages. Armenian nobles in silk robes, embroidered with gold thread, negotiate with Georgian princes over matters of mutual border security. Persian merchants display carpets in the covered markets, the wool so fine it flows like water through their hands, the dyes so vivid they seem to glow with inner light. Byzantine envoys carry sealed letters to the royal palace, their Greek guards conspicuous in their scale armor and red cloaks. Arab scholars debate fine points of theology in the madrasas, their arguments conducted in classical Arabic, though many speak Armenian or Persian as first languages. Kurdish caravanners water their camels at public fountains, while their cargo rests in warehouses operated by Armenian trading families whose networks extend from Constantinople to Samarkand, from the Crimean ports to the cities of Syria. The warehouses are substantial stone buildings with heavy doors and iron locks, staffed by agents who can read and write in multiple languages, who understand the complex systems of credit and debt that make long-distance trade possible. And the churches. Always the churches. They rise from the urban fabric like stone prayers, each one a statement of faith and power and wealth. The chroniclers, who gave Ani its famous epithet, the city of 1001 churches, were engaging in obvious hyperbole. Archaeological surveys suggest the actual number was closer to 40 or 50 significant churches and chapels, with perhaps another 100 small private chapels in noble households and monastic cells. But the exaggeration points toward truth. Nowhere else in the medieval world could match this concentration of sophisticated Christian architecture in such a confined space. The Cathedral of Ani, completed in the year 1001, soars above the city with an octagonal dome that seems to defy the limitations of stone and mortar. The dome rises on a drum pierced by windows, so that light floods the interior from above, creating an effect of heavenly radiance that leaves visitors standing in the nave with heads tilted back, mouths slightly open, overwhelmed by the engineering achievement and the theological symbolism it expresses. The architect, a man named Trat, whose name survives in inscriptions, had previously rebuilt the dome of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople after an earthquake. He brought those techniques to Ani and refined them, creating something lighter, more daring, more vertical in its aspiration. The Church of the Holy Apostles features double-shell construction techniques that will not appear in Western Europe for another century. Two concentric domes, separated by a space, allow for both structural stability and visual drama. The outer shell protects the inner from weather. The inner shell presents a smooth surface for frescoes. The space between them reduces the overall weight pressing down on the supporting walls. This is engineering sophistication on par with anything being built anywhere in the world during this period. The Church of St. Gregory displays carvings of such delicacy that sunlight filtering through the ornamental screens creates patterns on the floor that shift with the hours. The stone carvers who created these works understood light as a sculptural medium. They calculated angles, anticipated the sun's path across the sky, designed openings that would capture specific effects at specific times. During the Liturgy of the Hours, when monks chanted the Psalms at dawn, midday, and dusk, the light would paint the floor with shadows that reinforced the sacred geometry of prayer. These were not merely houses of worship. They were statements of power, demonstrations of wealth, attempts to build permanence in an impermanent world. Each one represented enormous investment of resources and labor. Stone had to be quarried and transported. Scaffolding had to be erected. Master masons had to be hired and housed and fed, along with their teams of apprentices and laborers. Lime for mortar had to be burned in kilns. Timber for roof beams had to be imported from forests in the Caucasus Mountains. Lead for roof sheathing had to be purchased from merchants who brought it along the Silk Road from mines in Central Asia. Each church proclaimed that Anis's prosperity would last forever, that its glory would echo through the ages, that its stones would stand when the kingdoms of men had turned to dust. The irony writes itself across the empty plateau, where those same stones now crumble into the earth that will eventually reclaim them entirely. But in the year 1010, standing in the plaza before the cathedral, watching nobles and merchants and pilgrims flowing in and out of the great bronze doors, no one imagines ruin. No one can conceive of a future where these streets are silent, where grass grows between the paving stones, where the only visitors are sheep and the occasional archaeologist taking measurements. But here is what the conventional histories miss, what gets lost in catalogues of architectural achievement and dynastic succession. Ani's true significance was never its churches. Those magnificent structures were symptoms, not causes. They were how wealth was displayed, not how wealth was generated. The real story of Ani lies not in its monuments, but in its function, not in what it proclaimed about itself, but in what it actually did. Ani was a neutral trading hub in an age that increasingly demanded you choose sides. It was a cosmopolitan space where religious and ethnic differences mattered less than commercial reliability. It was a city that grew wealthy by providing services rather than demanding tribute, by facilitating exchange rather than extracting resources through conquest. And it is precisely this model, this demonstration, that prosperity could emerge from neutrality and commercial sophistication rather than military expansion, that made Ani threatening to every empire that came after. Consider what this means in practice. A Persian merchant arrives in Ani with a caravan of silk. He is Muslim. He speaks Farsi. His home city is Nishapur, more than 2,000 kilometers to the east. He does not know the local language. He does not share the religious faith of the city's rulers. He has no family connections here, no tribal affiliations, no feudal obligations. In most medieval cities, he would be vulnerable, dependent on finding coreligionists or fellow Persians to vouch for him, subject to arbitrary taxes and potential violence. But in Ani, he goes to the caravanserai. He pays a standard fee. He receives a receipt written in Persian and Armenian, stamped with the royal seal. His goods are stored in a locked warehouse. His camels are watered and fed. He sleeps in a clean room with other merchants. In the morning, he goes to the market district, where Armenian merchants inspect his silk. They negotiate a price. Payment is made partly in silver coin minted in Ani, partly in letters of credit drawn on merchant houses in Constantinople. The exchange rate is standardized. Scribes witness the transaction. Everything is documented in duplicate, one copy for each party. This is not romantic, multicultural harmony. This is pragmatic, commercial infrastructure. The Persian merchant does not need to love Armenians. The Armenian buyers do not need to approve of Islam. They need only trust that the system will function predictably, that contracts will be enforced, that disputes will be resolved through established procedures rather than through violence or arbitrary royal decree. This trust is the real product Ani provides. The city is selling certainty in an uncertain world, predictability in an age of chaos. To understand how and why this happened, we must go back to the beginning, to the moment when Armenian nobles reclaimed independence after centuries of Arab rule and built something unprecedented on this windswept plateau. We must trace the rise of the Bagratid dynasty and the distinctive political economy they created. We must examine the choice to invest in churches rather than armies, in commercial neutrality rather than territorial expansion. And we must confront the uncomfortable truth that what made Ani glorious also made it vulnerable, that its greatest strength contained the seeds of its destruction. The Bagratid dynasty emerges from the wreckage of the Abbasid Caliphate's decline in the mid-9th century. For 2 centuries, Armenian territories have been ruled from Baghdad by Arab governors who extracted tribute and maintained garrisons, but otherwise left local aristocracies largely intact. This arrangement, oppressive but stable, begins to fracture as the Caliphate's central authority weakens under the pressure of Turkish slave soldiers who increasingly dominate the military, provincial governors who declare de facto independence, and religious sectarian conflicts that undermine ideological unity. Regional strongmen assert independence across the former caliphate's periphery. Border regions become contested spaces where multiple powers claim authority, but none can enforce it consistently. And in this chaos, opportunity arises for those bold enough and clever enough to seize it. The Armenian nobility, who have survived centuries of foreign rule by being indispensable as local administrators and military commanders, recognize that the old order is dying and a new one is being born. Ashat the Great, whose family has served as hereditary leaders of Armenia under Arab suzerainty, makes his move in the year 884. He takes the title King of Armenia, claiming sovereignty that has not existed since the Persian Sassanid conquest 3 centuries earlier. But Ashat is careful, pragmatic, brilliant in his balancing act. He pays tribute to the Caliph in Baghdad while also acknowledging the authority of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. He builds alliances with Georgian princes to his east while maintaining commercial relationships with Muslim Emirates to his south. He demonstrates that a small kingdom can survive between empires, not through military might, but through diplomatic flexibility and economic utility. This is the foundational insight that will govern Annie's rise. You do not need to be strong if you can make yourself useful. You do not need vast armies if you can convince surrounding powers that you are more valuable as a neutral intermediary than as a conquered province. Ashat's genius lies in understanding that the great empires of his era, declining Abbasid Caliphate, the resurgent Byzantine Empire, the emerging Turkic powers all need places where their merchants can meet without triggering diplomatic incidents, where goods can be exchanged without either empire claiming exclusive control. His descendants follow this template, refining it into a comprehensive strategy that becomes the Bagratid model of statecraft. They choose Ani as their capital, specifically because of its location. Positioned on high ground at the confluence of multiple trade routes, defensible yet accessible, the city offers both security and commercial opportunity. The gorges provide natural protection on 2 sides. The western approach can be defended with well-designed fortifications. The plateau offers ample space for urban expansion. Springs in the surrounding hills provide reliable water. The volcanic tuff offers excellent building material available through local quarrying. The kings invest heavily in infrastructure, understanding that commerce flows toward predictability and away from chaos. They fund the construction of caravanserais, where traveling merchants can rest their animals and store goods in safety. These are substantial buildings, not mere inns. They feature courtyards where camels and horses can be tethered, warehouses with thick walls and strong doors, dormitories with sleeping platforms, kitchens where meals are prepared, and small chapels or prayer rooms where travelers of different faiths can observe their devotions. The kings establish courts where commercial disputes can be arbitrated according to standardized procedures. Judges are appointed who understand both Armenian law and the various legal traditions of the merchants who use Anis's markets. They develop a reputation for fairness that becomes one of Anis's most valuable assets. A merchant who is cheated can appeal to the royal court and expect to receive a hearing, to have evidence considered, to obtain a judgment based on established precedent rather than on who pays the largest bribe. This is rare enough in the medieval world to be worth its weight in gold. They mint reliable coinage accepted across a wide geographic area. The silver content is standardized. The coins are uniform in weight. They bear clear inscriptions that prevent counterfeiting. Merchants learn to trust honest coinage the way they trust very little else. In an age where most coins are debased, where silver content varies wildly, where kings regularly call in currency and reissue it with less precious metal, Ana's commitment to monetary stability becomes a form of soft power that extends far beyond the city's walls. They create, in essence, the institutional framework for long-distance trade to flourish. This is not accidental. This is deliberate policy maintained across multiple reigns, refined through experience, transmitted from father to son as the core principle of begraded statecraft. Make Ani indispensable, not through military power, but through commercial reliability. Make the city so useful to surrounding empires that conquest becomes irrational, that the value of a neutral Ani exceeds the value of a conquered Ani. The churches come later. Once the wealth begins accumulating in royal treasuries and merchant counting houses, King Spat II builds the cathedral as a monument to his piety and his power, funding the construction through taxes on trade and loans from merchant families who understand that royal patronage of religion is also patronage of the social order that protects their businesses. King Gagik I constructs the Church of St. Gregory, dedicating it to the saint who converted Armenia to Christianity 7 centuries earlier, anchoring his new dynasty to ancient traditions. Noble families compete to fund their own architectural monuments. Each church represents a family's arrival among the elite, their transformation from mere wealthy merchants to patrons of sacred architecture. The Church of St. John the Baptist is funded by the Palavuni family, whose trading networks extend to the Black Sea ports. The Church of the Holy Mother of God is patronized by the Artsruni family, who control lucrative iron mines in the mountains to the south. This is not primarily about piety, though genuine religious devotion certainly exists among these donors. This is about legitimacy and display and securing a family's place in the social hierarchy through permanent endowment. These kings do not rule by ancient hereditary right stretching back to time immemorial. They cannot claim descent from legendary founders or gods made flesh. They are new money, recently independent, always vulnerable to the claim that they are usurpers who seized power during a moment of chaos. The churches proclaim permanence. They signal divine favor. They demonstrate that Anas rulers can mobilize resources on a scale that rivals any power in the region. They transform mercantile wealth into sacred architecture, thereby transmuting the profane into the holy and securing legitimacy that mere gold cannot buy. King Gag I, who rules from 918 to 1020, represents the apogee of this system. Chroniclers describe him as learned in theology and philosophy, pious in his observance of fasts and festivals, and commercially astute in his understanding of trade networks and monetary policy. Byzantine emperors seek alliance with him, offering marriage alliances and military partnerships. Arab emirs respect his neutrality and send envoys to negotiate agreements about shared borders and mutual non-aggression. The wealth flowing through Ani allows him to maintain a small but professional standing army, sufficient for defense against bandits and minor incursions, but not large enough or aggressive enough to alarm his more powerful neighbors. This calibration is crucial. A kingdom with no military capacity invites conquest. A kingdom with aggressive, expansionist ambitions triggers preemptive invasion from neighbors who fear being attacked. Ani maintains the delicate balance, strong enough to defend itself, weak enough not to threaten anyone, useful enough that the cost of conquest would exceed the benefits. Gagik famously refuses. Byzantine offers of military alliance that would require him to commit troops to imperial campaigns against Arab enemies. The Byzantine emperor is offended, but ultimately accepts the refusal because Enna's neutrality serves Byzantine commercial interests. Byzantine merchants use Ani as a place to purchase Persian and Central Asian goods without dealing directly with Muslim emirates. The tax revenue generated by this trade flows partly to Ani and partly to Byzantine provincial governors in nearby territories. Everyone benefits from the current arrangement. Why destroy it through unreasonable demands? This is the Bagratid Compact in practice. The merchant class funds the monarchy through taxes and loans. The monarchy protects the conditions that allow commerce to thrive: stable currency, fair courts, reliable infrastructure, and above all, neutrality, enforced through diplomatic skill rather than military power. No questions asked about where your goods come from or where they are going. No religious tests for market access. No favoritism based on ethnicity or language. No arbitrary confiscations or sudden changes in tax policy. You pay your fees, clearly posted and consistently enforced. You follow the rules, which are written down and available for inspection. You conduct your business with the confidence that contracts will be honored and disputes will be arbitrated, and the crown guarantees your safety while you are within Ani's walls. Backed by professional guards who patrol the markets and by a legal system that punishes violence against merchants with particular severity, because violence against merchants is violence against the system that generates royal revenue. The system works brilliantly for more than a century. Ani grows wealthy beyond the dreams of its founders. Gold accumulates in royal treasuries, stored in underground vaults beneath the palace. Merchant families build mansions that would impress Byzantine patricians, with mosaics on the floors, frescoes on the walls, and libraries containing books in Armenian, Greek, Arabic, and Persian. Artisans perfect techniques in metalworking that produce intricate gold jewelry with filigree so fine it resembles lace. Manuscript illuminators create gospels whose miniature paintings feature gold leaf and ultramarine blue made from crushed lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan. The city becomes a magnet for talent from across the region. Scholars come seeking patronage from wealthy nobles who compete to maintain the most impressive private libraries and the most learned household chaplains. Artists come seeking commissions from churches that pay well and provide opportunities to work at the highest level of their craft. Refugees from less stable regions come seeking safety and opportunity, bringing with them skills and knowledge that enrich the urban economy. Armenian becomes a language of literature and theology. The monastery of Hormos, located near Ani, becomes a center of manuscript production, whose output rivals any scriptorium in the Christian world. Monks copy not only religious texts, but also classical philosophy, medical treatises, astronomical tables, and historical chronicles. They develop a distinctive style of manuscript illumination that will influence Armenian art for centuries. They train generations of scribes who will carry their skills to Armenian communities across the diaspora when the city falls. But there is a fundamental problem that becomes visible only in retrospect, only after the system has collapsed and historians can analyze the wreckage. The entire model depends on surrounding powers continuing to tolerate neutral spaces, continuing to value commercial connections more than territorial control. It depends on a world where the benefits of trade outweigh the temptations of conquest. where empires accept the existence of small independent states because those states serve useful functions. And that world is ending, though the kings of Ani seem not to notice until far too late. The signals are visible if you know how to read them. The Byzantine Empire is becoming more centralized, more bureaucratic, more insistent on direct control of territories rather than indirect influence through client states. The Seljuk Turks are building a new kind of military state organized around cavalry warfare and religious ideology that does not recognize the legitimacy of neutral zones. The Crusades are about to begin, bringing with them a militant Christianity that sees all Muslims as enemies and all neutrality as betrayal. The 10th and 11th centuries witness a profound transformation in the political organization of Eurasia. The decentralized power structures that followed the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West and the fragmentation of the early caliphates in the East are giving way to more centralized, territorially defined states that claim exclusive sovereignty over the populations and resources within their borders. The Byzantine Empire, under the Macedonian dynasty, pushes east and south, reclaiming lands lost to Arab invasions centuries earlier. The Seljuk Turks, recent converts to Islam whose military prowess terrifies settled populations from Persia to Anatolia, build an empire organized around the principle that political authority derives from military conquest, sanctified by religious duty. The Crusades loom on the horizon, though they have not yet begun in Ani's golden age. But the mentality that will produce the Crusades is already forming, an increasingly rigid militarization of religious identity, a growing conviction that Christendom and Islam are locked in civilizational conflict, a rejection of the pragmatic tolerance that allowed places like Ani to thrive. This new world has no place for neutral trading cities. You are Christian or Muslim, Byzantine or Seljuk, with us or against us. In this changing environment, Ani's neutrality begins to look less like wisdom and more like weakness, less like valuable service and more like evasion of proper allegiance. Byzantine emperors, who once valued Ani as a trading partner, now see its wealth as rightfully theirs. Reparations owed for the protection the empire provides against Muslim expansion. Why should Ani prosper from trade between Christian and Muslim when the empire bears the cost of defending the frontier? Why should Armenian kings refuse military alliance when the security of Christendom is at stake? Seljuk commanders, pushing west from Persia with armies of Turkish cavalry, see a rich city defended by inadequate fortifications and ruled by kings who have chosen commerce over martial prowess. The walls are impressive but not formidable. The army is professional but small. The population is large but not militarized. This is a target, not a threat. This is wealth waiting to be conquered, awaiting only the right moment and sufficient justification. The space for neutrality contracts with each passing year. The merchant families of Ani understand what is happening before the royal court does. You can track it in their behavior, in the decisions recorded in commercial contracts and property deeds that survive in Armenian monasteries, where monks preserved documents. Beginning around the year 1000, wealthy Armenian merchants start establishing secondary residences in Constantinople, in the Crimean ports, in Jerusalem. They are hedging their bets, diversifying their assets, creating exit options. They purchase houses in the Byzantine capital, establishing commercial offices there so their businesses can continue if Ani becomes untenable. They place younger sons in partnerships with Greek merchants, creating family networks that span the Byzantine Empire. They deposit funds with Italian banking families, beginning to operate in the Eastern Mediterranean. They are preparing for the possibility that Anna's golden age might not last forever, that the conditions allowing neutral commercial cities to thrive might be temporary rather than permanent. The royal court, by contrast, continues investing in churches. King Gagic I funds the Church of St. Gregory in the year 1001. His successor continues this program of religious construction. Each new church is an act of faith that the old system will endure, that diplomacy and commercial utility will continue to protect a small kingdom caught between empires. Each new church is a wager that permanence is achievable through sacred architecture, that building for eternity will somehow guarantee eternity. This is normalcy bias on a civilizational scale. The Bagratid kings have lived their entire lives in a world where neutrality worked, where careful diplomacy and commercial indispensability provided security. Their fathers and grandfathers succeeded through this strategy. Every incentive in their immediate environment suggests continuing on the same path. The wealth keeps accumulating in royal treasuries. The merchants keep trading in the markets. The churches keep rising toward heaven. Why would you fundamentally alter an approach that has brought such spectacular success? But wealth displayed becomes wealth coveted. Every magnificent church is simultaneously a testament to Ani's prosperity and an advertisement to potential conquerors of the riches waiting to be seized. The very monuments built to proclaim permanence become arguments for invasion. Byzantine generals, looking east from their garrisons, can see Ani's churches rising above the plateau. Look at what they have built with trade revenue. These generals must reason. Imagine what their treasuries must contain. What plunder awaits an army that breaches those walls. All of it behind fortifications, defended by a small professional army, in a kingdom with no significant military allies, no network of feudal obligations that would bring reinforcements in time of crisis. The crisis comes in the year 1020, when King Gag I dies after a reign of 31 years. His successor, Havhansmat III, inherits a kingdom at the height of its wealth and the beginning of its vulnerability. He faces a very different geopolitical situation than his predecessors. The Byzantine Emperor Basil II, fresh from his brutal conquest of Bulgaria, where he blinded 15,000 captured soldiers and sent them home as a warning to future rebels, now turns his attention to Armenia. Basil has spent his entire reign expanding Byzantine territory, reclaiming lands lost during the empire's decline. He is not a man who accepts independent kingdoms on his frontier when conquest is possible. His terms are simple and non-negotiable: accept Byzantine protection. Cede Ani to imperial control upon the king's death, and the arrangement will be called alliance rather than conquest. You will retain royal dignity during your lifetime. Your nobles will keep their estates. The church will retain its authority over religious matters, but ultimate sovereignty passes to the empire. Refuse these terms, and the empire will take Ani by force and install its own governor immediately, without the courtesies being offered now. This is not a choice in any meaningful sense. This is extortion dressed in diplomatic language, coercion presented as generous terms. But Havhansma signs the agreement in the year 1020. Perhaps hoping that circumstances will change before his death, makes the agreement operative. perhaps believing his successors will find legal technicalities to void the arrangement, perhaps simply paralyzed by the impossibility of military resistance. What can Ani's small army do against the Byzantine Empire at the height of its power? Resistance means certain conquest and probable devastation. Submission offers at least the possibility that something might be preserved. He dies in 1040, and the Byzantine emperor prepares to claim his inheritance. But the Armenian nobles, who were not parties to the agreement and do not feel bound by it, delay implementation. They argue over legal technicalities, claiming that Havhanspat exceeded his authority in signing away the kingdom's independence, that such fundamental transfers of sovereignty require the consent of the noble council. They elevate a new king, Gagek II, who refuses to honor his predecessor's commitment, claiming it was extracted under duress and is therefore void according to both Armenian law and imperial precedent. For 5 years, they resist the inevitable through procedural obstruction and diplomatic maneuvering, clinging to the fiction of independence even as Byzantine pressure increases. They send embassies to Constantinople, arguing their case, hiring the best Greek lawyers to construct arguments about sovereignty and legitimate succession. They appeal to the Patriarch of Constantinople for ecclesiastical support. They even send envoys to the Seljuks, discreetly exploring whether the enemy of my enemy might become a friend. Whether Turkish protection might be preferable to Byzantine conquest, but time runs against them. The Byzantines are patient because they are confident. The legal arguments will eventually exhaust themselves. The Patriarch will not defy the emperor. The Seljuks will not risk war with Byzantium for the sake of an Armenian kingdom. In 1045, the Byzantines lose patience with the charade. Imperial troops march east under the command of General Michael Iosites. They encounter no significant resistance because honest nobles have finally accepted the inevitable. The gates open. Byzantine standards are raised above the walls. The commercial neutral zone becomes an imperial frontier garrison. The transformation is swift and comprehensive. Byzantine commanders replace Armenian administrators in key positions. Tax collectors arrive with new schedules that redirect revenue from the royal treasury to the imperial fisc. Orthodox clergy arrive to assert the authority of the Chalcedonian Church over the Armenian Apostolic Church, which the Byzantines view as schismatic. The theological disputes are obscure to outsiders' arguments about the nature of Christ's divinity that seem abstract until you understand they determine who controls church property and ecclesiastical appointments. New taxes fund imperial priorities. The garrison that now occupies Anis Citadel, the fortress being constructed on the eastern approach, the imperial postal system that now extends to Aina as the eastern terminus. The neutrality that generated Aina's wealth evaporates overnight. The city is no longer a place where Byzantine and Persian merchants meet on neutral ground. It is Byzantine territory, which means Persian merchants are now dealing with their empire's primary rival. The commercial networks begin to strain and fracture. The merchants begin leaving in earnest now, not in panic, but in calculated decisions about where future opportunities lie. If Ani is simply another Byzantine provincial city, subject to imperial taxation and imperial trade policies, they reason, why not relocate to Constantinople itself, where imperial patronage and larger markets await? Why remain on a frontier that may become a battlefield if the Seljuks decide to challenge Byzantine expansion? the Armenian trading networks that stretched across Eurasia, built over generations of family relationships and carefully cultivated trust, start shifting their hubs to Crimean ports, to Syrian cities, to anywhere that offers the commercial predictability that Ani once provided. The warehouses begin to empty. The caravanserais host fewer travelers. The markets see declining traffic. The city continues functioning, its population still substantial, its churches still conducting liturgy, but the animating principle that made it unique has been extinguished. The Byzantines fortify Ani according to imperial strategic priorities, preparing it to serve as a bulwark against the Seljuk threat advancing from the east. They build up the garrison to 3,000 professional soldiers, billeted in barracks, constructed in what were formerly merchant districts. They improve the walls, adding new towers and thickening weak sections. They construct a fortress on the eastern approach where Byzantine catapults command the plateau. They transform a trading city into a military outpost, and in doing so, they make it a target that must be attacked rather than a neutral space that can be tolerated. The Seljuks, who might have been content to trade with a neutral Ani, have no interest in leaving a Byzantine fortress on their western frontier as their empire expands into Anatolia. The logic of imperial rivalry makes conflict inevitable. The only question is timing, and the Seljuks choose their moment carefully, waiting until Byzantine attention is diverted elsewhere, until the garrison is undermanned, until the conditions favor a swift campaign. The conquest comes in 1064. The Seljuk commander Alp Arslan, whose name means heroic lion and whose reputation for military brilliance is already legendary, lays siege to Ani with an army estimated at between 15,000 and 20,000 warriors, mostly Turkish cavalry, armed with composite bows that can penetrate armor at 200 paces. The Byzantine garrison, undermanned because troops have been recalled to face threats elsewhere, holds out for 25 days. The siege follows the grim pattern of medieval warfare. The Seljuks surround the city, cutting off access to the springs that feed the aqueducts. They build siege engines and begin battering the walls. They send miners to dig beneath the fortifications, placing timbers in the tunnels that will be burned to collapse the walls above. The defenders make sorties to disrupt these operations, small, desperate battles in the shadow of the walls, where men kill each other for control of a mine shaft or a siege engine. When the walls are finally breached, probably through a section undermined by Seljuk miners, the assault comes in a rush of violence that contemporary chronicles describe in fragmentary, contradictory detail. What follows fits the pattern of medieval siege warfare, looting as payment for the soldiers who risked death in the assault, destruction of anything that might be useful to a returning Byzantine army, population displacement as inhabitants are killed or enslaved or flee into the surrounding countryside. The precise details dissolve into the fog of war and the bias of chroniclers writing with their own agendas. Armenian sources emphasize atrocities, cataloging destruction of churches and murder of clergy. Byzantine sources emphasize the heroism of the defenders and the barbarism of the Turks. Later, Turkish sources emphasize the legitimate conquest of territory through military prowess. What matters for our purposes is that when the Seljuks withdraw, after extracting whatever portable wealth remains and establishing nominal control, Ani is fundamentally broken. The commercial networks that took generations to build have been shattered. The merchant families have fled or been killed or enslaved. The warehouses are empty, many burned during the sack. The markets are silent. The caravanserais are abandoned. The churches still stand, mostly, though several have been damaged, and the cathedral's dome has partially collapsed from fire or deliberate destruction. The population, reduced by perhaps half, huddles in the ruins, trying to rebuild some semblance of normal life. Over the next 2 centuries, Ani changes hands repeatedly in conflicts whose details become increasingly difficult to track as Armenian chronicle writing declines, and the city becomes a footnote in larger imperial narratives. Seljuks hold it for periods. Georgian kings seize it during moments of Seljuk weakness. Kurdish dynasties claim it as various Turkish emirates fragment into smaller principalities. Mongols sweep through in the 13th century, their invasion so devastating that chroniclers struggle to find language adequate to describe it. Each conquest brings destruction and population loss. Each period of stability sees partial recovery that is then undone by the next wave of violence. Earthquakes in 1319 and 1501 topple structures already weakened by neglect and conflict. The ground shakes, and walls carefully fitted by master masons crack and shift. Domes collapse, crushing whatever is beneath them. The aqueducts fracture, cutting off water supplies that make the plateau inhabitable. These are natural disasters, but they strike a city already dying, accelerating decline that human violence has initiated. Trade routes shift south to Tabriz, which offers better connections to the emerging Safavid Persian state and is situated in a valley with more reliable water and agricultural land. The Black Death, which reaches this region in the mid-14th century, kills perhaps a third of the remaining population. Those who survive have every incentive to leave, to seek opportunity in cities that have not been repeatedly sacked, where buildings are intact and commerce thrives. The last permanent residents abandon Ani sometime in the late 16th or early 17th century. The exact date is unknown because, by this point, no one is keeping records. No chroniclers consider the city important enough to note its final abandonment. People simply leave in small groups over the course of decades, until one day the last family departs and no one is left. Nature begins the slow work of reclamation, patient and inexorable. Vines grow through windows, their roots working into cracks in the mortar. Roofs collapse when supporting timbers rot. Streets disappear under wind-blown soil and grass that seeds itself from the surrounding steppe. But the physical abandonment of Ani is almost beside the point when measured against what has been lost. What truly died was not bricks and mortar, but an idea, a demonstration that certain forms of social organization were possible. Ani proved that neutrality and commercial sophistication could provide security in a world of empires. It demonstrated that cosmopolitan spaces could thrive, that religious and ethnic differences could be subordinated to commercial pragmatism, that flexibility mattered more than rigid identity in creating durable prosperity. The empires that rose to dominance after Anna's fall had no use for such ideas. They demanded total allegiance from populations within their borders. They organized territory into exclusive spheres of control, where every square kilometer had to belong definitively to one empire or another. They militarized religious and ethnic identities, making them markers of political loyalty rather than private matters of faith and culture. And they systematically erased or suppressed memories of places like Ani that suggested alternative possibilities, that hinted that the imperial model might not be the only way to organize political space. The Ottoman Empire, which absorbs the ruins of Ani into its eastern provinces in the late 16th century, keeps almost no administrative records of the place. Ottoman cadastral surveys, meticulous in documenting villages and tax revenues and garrison locations throughout eastern Anatolia, barely mention Ani. When the site appears in records at all, it is listed simply as ruins without elaboration. This cannot be mere oversight or bureaucratic inefficiency. The ruins are substantial, visible for kilometers across the plateau, obviously the remains of a major urban center. Travelers passing through the region cannot miss them. The silence suggests deliberate policy, a choice to let nothing about this place enter the official record. Why? Because acknowledging Ana's existence would complicate the narrative that Ottoman ideologists are constructing about Anatolia's history. The official story holds that this region has been Turkish and Muslim since the Seljuk conquest in the 11th century, that the Turkish population represents continuous settlement since that time, that Ottoman rule is simply the latest phase of a Turkish presence stretching back centuries. Ani contradicts this narrative. It is physical evidence of a pre-Turkish Christian civilization that thrived in eastern Anatolia for centuries before the Seljuks arrived. It suggests that Armenian claims to this territory might have historical merit, that the region's identity is more complex than the official narrative allows. Better to ignore it, to let it crumble, unrecorded, than to acknowledge facts that might encourage Armenian subjects to think of themselves as indigenous people temporarily ruled by foreign conquerors, rather than as a tolerated minority within a Muslim state. The Russian Empire, which seizes the region from the Ottomans in the late 19th century during one of its periodic wars, takes the opposite approach to Ani's ruins. Russian archaeologists descend on the site with measuring tools, cameras, and scholarly enthusiasm. They document every church, every inscription, every architectural detail with the methodical thoroughness that characterizes 19th century archaeology at its best. They produce measured drawings. They photograph ruins from multiple angles. They copy inscriptions before weathering can erase them. They publish lavishly illustrated monographs that circulate among European scholarly audiences hungry for information about exotic Eastern civilizations. And they frame their findings in explicitly political terms that serve Russian imperial interests. The official interpretation, repeated in archaeological reports and popular accounts, emphasizes the glory of Christian Armenian civilization and the destruction wrought by Muslim conquest. See what the Turks destroyed, these accounts proclaim. See the churches that were desecrated, the Christian population that was displaced or forced to convert. See why Orthodox Russia must protect these sacred sites and act as guardian of the Christian populations still living under Muslim rule. The archaeology of Ani becomes justification for Russian imperial expansion and for Russian claims to exercise a protectorate over Christian minorities throughout the Ottoman Empire. This is the pattern of 19th century European imperialism, archaeological discovery in the service of contemporary political goals. Scholarship deployed as soft power to legitimize territorial ambitions. The Russian archaeologists are sincere scholars doing important work, but their work serves a larger imperial project, whether they fully acknowledge it or not. When the Ottoman Empire finally collapses after World War I, defeated and dismembered by the Allied powers, the new Turkish Republic that emerges from the wreckage faces the challenge of constructing a national identity for a state that no longer rules a multi-ethnic empire. The solution promoted by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and the Republican elite, is to define Turkey as Turkish and Muslim, to emphasize ethnic and religious homogeneity over the polyglot diversity that characterized the Ottoman system. This requires rewriting history to emphasize Turkic migrations into Anatolia and Seljuk military conquests, while minimizing or erasing the civilizations that existed before. Turkish arrival. Armenian presence in eastern Anatolia, already devastated by the genocide of 1915, in which perhaps 1 million Armenians were killed or died during forced deportations, becomes literally unspeakable in official Turkish discourse. To mention it is to risk accusations of treason, of insulting Turkishness, of promoting separatism. Anas ruins, which stand as physical evidence of centuries of Armenian civilization in eastern Anatolia, become acutely embarrassing to this nationalist project. The site is left to deteriorate without state intervention. No preservation efforts are funded during the early decades of the Republic. The ruins become a restricted military zone near the closed border with Soviet Armenia. Tourists are discouraged through bureaucratic obstacles and lack of infrastructure. Foreign researchers are denied permits. Turkish researchers who want to study the site must frame their work carefully to avoid suggesting that Anas Armenian heritage has contemporary political implications. The message is clear: better to let Ani crumble into dust than to acknowledge what its proper preservation would imply about the history of eastern Anatolia, about who lived in this region before the Turkish conquest, about the violence that displaced that population. The ruins are too substantial to completely hide, but they can be neglected, fenced off, left to decay slowly, while attention is directed elsewhere. Soviet Armenia, meanwhile, develops its own relationship with Ani's memory. The ruins become part of Armenian national heritage narrative, proof of the ancient homeland from which Armenians were violently displaced, evidence supporting territorial claims to lands currently controlled by Turkey. The site is featured on postage stamps, in history textbooks, in propaganda films. It becomes a symbol of Armenian suffering and survival, of civilization destroyed but not forgotten, of a homeland that waits across a closed border. The fact that neither Soviet Armenia nor its citizens can actually visit Ani the border is sealed, militarized, impossible to cross, makes the city more powerful as symbol. It becomes a pure absence, a void that can be filled with whatever meanings serve current political needs. In the absence of direct experience, Ani can be idealized, made to carry the full weight of national longing for a lost homeland. It becomes not a real place with all the complexity that real places contain, but a symbol of everything that was taken from Armenians: land, security, continuity with the past, the ability to live in the places their ancestors built. The actual physical city continues deteriorating through all these symbolic appropriations and political manipulations. Winter freezes, cracks stones when water seeps into cracks and expands as it turns to ice. Spring runoff undermines foundations as drainage systems fail and water pools against walls. Summer heat causes expansion and contraction that loosens mortar. In the 1950s and 60s, according to reports that later emerge, Turkish military units stationed near Ani use some of the ruined churches for target practice, shelling medieval architecture as part of training exercises. In the 1980s, a controversial restoration project funded by the Turkish government actually accelerates decay through well-intentioned but disastrous interventions. Concrete is applied to medieval stones in ways that trap moisture and promote erosion through differential expansion rates between modern and ancient materials. Inappropriate mortar is used that is harder than the original stones. So when stress occurs, the stones crack rather than the joints giving way as the original builders intended. These interventions, presented as preservation, represent either incompetence or deliberate destruction disguised as conservation. When the Soviet Union collapses in 1991 and Armenia becomes independent, hopes briefly rise among Armenian communities worldwide that the border might open, that Ani might become accessible, that proper preservation work might begin with international cooperation. These hopes are disappointed. Relations between Armenia and Turkey remain hostile, frozen in mutual recrimination over the genocide and its legacy. Turkey continues refusing to acknowledge the genocide. Armenia continues demanding recognition and potentially reparations. The border remains closed, one of the few completely sealed frontiers in the modern world. Ani continues serving as a pawn in this geopolitical dispute, its ruins instrumentalized by both sides. For Armenia, Ani represents the genocide and Turkish refusal to acknowledge historical crimes. For Turkey, Ani represents Armenian irredentism and unfounded territorial claims. Neither side can afford to treat Ani simply as a medieval city that should be preserved for its historical and architectural significance, because doing so would mean abandoning the political narratives each has constructed around the ruins. UNESCO finally designates Ani a World Heritage Site in 2016, after years of lobbying by international preservation organizations. Turkey presents this designation as evidence of its commitment to cultural preservation and tolerance, as proof that it protects sites of all religious and ethnic backgrounds. International conservation experts are finally allowed systematic access to conduct surveys and develop preservation plans. Funding is allocated for stabilization of the most endangered structures. And yet, the fundamental contradictions remain unresolved beneath this surface activity. Ani cannot be properly preserved without acknowledging its Armenian heritage, without explaining in interpretive materials that this was an Armenian city, that the churches were built by Armenian kings and funded by Armenian nobles, that the inscriptions are in Armenian and record Armenian names. But acknowledging this heritage fully and honestly contradicts Turkish nationalist narratives about Eastern Anatolia's history, narratives that remain politically powerful and emotionally resonant for many Turkish citizens. The compromise is a kind of preservation theater. Tourism to the site is encouraged because it brings revenue to nearby Turkish towns and improves Turkey's international image. A visitor center is constructed. Paths are marked. Information panels are installed. But the interpretive materials systematically downplay Armenian identity, referring vaguely to Christian architecture without specifying which Christian community built it, emphasizing the Seljuk conquest as if that somehow transfers cultural ownership of everything that came before. The result is preservation that preserves form while erasing meaning. Heritage management that protects stones while obscuring whose heritage those stones represent. It is exactly the kind of half measure that satisfies no one. Armenians see it as continued denial and appropriation. Turkish nationalists resent any acknowledgement of Armenian heritage at all. International preservation experts grow frustrated at the political constraints preventing proper interpretation. And the ruins themselves continue deteriorating because the political will for comprehensive preservation work remains absent. Stand at those ruins today, and you stand at the intersection of competing memories, each claiming exclusive right to interpret these stones, each insisting on a particular version of history that serves contemporary political needs. For Armenian diaspora communities scattered across the world, from Glendale to Paris to Beirut, Ani represents the homeland lost in the genocide, the civilization destroyed by Turkish conquest, the wound that will never heal until historical justice is achieved through recognition, through acknowledgement, perhaps through reparations, or even territorial restitution. For Turkish nationalists, Ani represents proof that Eastern Anatolia was conquered by Turkish arms in the Middle Ages and thus rightfully belongs to the Turkish state, that Armenian claims represent irredentism and historical revisionism, that acknowledging Armenian heritage means legitimizing territorial demands that could threaten Turkish sovereignty. The ruins become evidence in an ongoing political argument rather than simply the remains of a medieval city worthy of study and preservation on their own merits. For UNESCO and the international preservation community, Ani represents universal human heritage that transcends national claims, a masterpiece of medieval architecture that belongs to all humanity rather than to any particular nation or ethnic group. This perspective offers attractive neutrality, but it becomes effectively meaningless without engagement with the very national conflicts it seeks to transcend. You cannot preserve a site without interpreting it, and you cannot interpret it without taking positions on contested historical questions. Each narrative contains elements of truth and serves particular political functions. The Armenian narrative accurately describes genocide and cultural destruction, correctly identifies systematic erasure of Armenian heritage from Turkish national narratives, and validly points to Ani as evidence of long Armenian presence in eastern Anatolia. But it risks freezing Ani in amber as a symbol of victimization, rather than engaging with the city's complex historical reality as a cosmopolitan trading hub where Armenian identity was one element among many. The Turkish narrative accurately describes Seljuk military conquest as a historical fact and correctly notes that conquest has been the basis for territorial sovereignty throughout history, that modern borders are products of past wars, whether we like it or not. But it deliberately erases 8 centuries of Armenian civilization before the Seljuk arrival, systematically obscures the genocide through euphemism and denial, and prevents honest reckoning with the violent displacement of Armenian populations that created the demographic reality on which Turkish claims to Eastern Anatolia rest. The UNESCO narrative offers the promise of neutral professionalism, of heritage management guided by scholarly expertise rather than nationalist passion. But this neutrality is itself a kind of evasion, a refusal to acknowledge that heritage preservation is always political, that decisions about what to preserve and how to interpret it inevitably take sides in contemporary conflicts, whether explicitly acknowledged or not. What gets lost in all these competing claims is the actual historical Ani, the cosmopolitan trading city where Armenian, Georgian, Kurdish, Persian, Byzantine, and Muslim merchants transacted business largely indifferent to the ethnic and religious categories that modern nationalisms insist are fundamental and unchanging aspects of identity. That city's most important legacy was not its churches, magnificent though they were as works of architecture, but its demonstration that prosperity could emerge from neutral spaces where rigid identities mattered less than commercial reliability. Ani showed that you could build a successful city-state by being useful to surrounding empires, rather than by conquering territory and extracting tribute. It demonstrated that ethnic and religious diversity could be assets rather than liabilities if managed through institutions that protected commercial predictability. It proved that small powers could survive between larger ones through diplomatic skill and economic indispensability, rather than through military strength. But that lesson is precisely what no modern nation-state wants to learn, or to have its citizens learn. Nation-states depend on exclusive territorial claims rooted in narratives of ethnic belonging. They require historical narratives that show their people rooted in particular territories since time immemorial, that present current borders as natural outcomes of deep historical processes rather than as contingent products of relatively recent wars and fratricides and population exchanges. Places like Ani, which thrived specifically by transcending ethnic and religious categories, by creating spaces where identity was fluid and multiple allegiances were normal and commercial. Relationships cut across the boundaries that modern nationalisms insist are natural and permanent. Such places threaten the foundational myths that nations tell about themselves. They suggest that ethnic homogeneity might not be necessary for prosperity, that neutral spaces might serve useful functions, that rigid identity categories might be modern inventions rather than eternal truths. So the physical city is allowed to decay while its memory is weaponized, carved up, and distributed among competing nationalist projects. Each side claims the ruins as evidence for their particular narrative, while systematically erasing everything that made Ani actually significant in its own time. The irony could not be more complete. A city that flourished by refusing to choose sides, by maintaining neutrality between empires, is now remembered exclusively through the lens of sides chosen centuries after its death. Interpreted entirely through conflicts, it would have worked to transcend had it survived. Listen to the wind moving through those empty churches now. Hear in that sound not merely the passage of time, but active forgetting, the deliberate erasure of possibilities. Every stone that falls, every wall that collapses, every inscription that weathers into illegibility represents not natural entropy, but the victory of exclusive nationalism over cosmopolitan memory, the triumph of rigid identity over fluid pragmatism. And yet the ruins persist, stubborn in their survival, damaged, deteriorating, misinterpreted, weaponized, but still there. The cathedral's walls still rise toward the sky even though its dome is gone. The fortifications still mark the city's perimeter even though grass grows between the stones. The arches still frame the landscape even though the structures they supported have collapsed centuries ago. There is something stubborn in this persistence, something that resists total erasure, even when every political incentive points toward letting the city disappear entirely into the earth that will eventually reclaim it. Perhaps this is the final paradox of Ani, the deepest irony in a story already rich with ironies. The city was built by people who believed in permanence, who thought their churches would stand forever, who could not imagine a future in which their names would be forgotten and their civilization would exist only as disputed fragments in nationalist propaganda. They invested enormous resources in creating monuments designed to defy time, to proclaim their builders' glory across the centuries, to ensure that future generations would know who built this place and what they achieved. And they failed completely. The churches crumble. The names are forgotten, except by specialists. The civilization exists now only in fragments and disputed memories that serve political purposes the builders could never have imagined. But the very act of building for permanence, doomed though it was to fail, created ruins substantial enough that total erasure remains impossible even when politically convenient. The attempt to deny impermanence produced structures that outlasted the empires, that built them even as they failed to outlast time itself. This brings us to the deepest question Ani poses, the question that transcends politics and nationalism and archaeological preservation, to touch something fundamental about human consciousness and our relationship with time. What does it mean that we build monuments knowing they will fail? Why do humans invest so much effort and resources in constructing permanence, when all evidence suggests that permanence is impossible, that everything eventually crumbles, that time defeats all attempts to escape its dominion? The answers lead into territory where history becomes philosophy, where the specific ruins of a particular medieval city gestured toward universal truths about mortality and meaning and the human need to leave traces that outlast individual lives. Terror management theory, developed by social psychologists studying how awareness of death shapes human behavior, suggests that mortality consciousness drives much of what we call civilization. We know we will die. This knowledge, unique among animals, or at least unique in its intensity and abstractness, produces anxiety that would be paralyzing if confronted directly and continuously. So we create symbolic immortality projects, cultural systems that promise some form of continuity beyond individual death. We have children who carry forward our genetic legacy and our names. We create works of art that preserve something of our perspective and sensibility. We build monuments that promise we will be remembered, that our existence will have left some permanent mark on the world. Religion offers literal immortality through concepts of eternal life or reincarnation. Nationalism offers absorption into a people or nation that transcends individual mortality. Architecture offers stone that will outlast flesh, structures that will stand when their builders are dust. The builders of Anis churches were engaged in exactly this project. They knew their individual lives were finite, that they would age and die and be buried. But they believed their city would endure, that their civilization would continue, that their churches would stand for centuries or millennia, telling future generations, "We were here, we built this, we mattered. Our lives meant something beyond mere survival and reproduction." The churches were not merely houses of worship, but attempts to defeat death through collective memory, encoded in stone and mortar. But time mocks all such efforts with perfect consistency. The builders are more thoroughly forgotten than the stones they laid. We do not know the names of the architects who designed the cathedral's innovative dome structure, who calculated the angles and thrusts, who solved the engineering problems that allowed that soaring space to exist. We do not know which merchants funded the Church of the Holy Apostles, what negotiations determined their contributions, what they hoped to gain in terms of prestige or divine favor. We do not know what prayers the priests spoke in those spaces, what sermons echoed from the pulpits, what songs rose from the choirs toward the domes. The monuments that were supposed to preserve memory have become its tombstones, marking places where memory died despite all efforts to prevent it. The stones remain, but the meaning has drained away, leaving only disputed fragments that serve purposes the builders never intended. This is the fate of all monuments eventually. to become evidence in arguments they were never meant to adjudicate, to serve political purposes that would horrify or baffle their creators, to outlast their meanings, even as they fail to outlast time. And yet we continue building, continue investing resources in monuments and memorials, continue constructing permanence, knowing what we know about impermanence, having thousands of years of ruined cities to demonstrate time's victory over human ambition, having Ozymandias and the pyramids and 100 other examples of monuments that failed to preserve what they were built to remember. Still we build, still we carve names in stone, still we design structures intended to last forever. This is not ignorance. We know the monuments will fail. This is denial elevated to civilizational principle, refusal to accept what we intellectually know to be true. Anis ruins reveal this denial with particular clarity because the city's erasure was not merely natural but deliberate, not just the work of time but the product of human choice. Yes, earthquakes damaged the structures. Yes, weather weathered the stones. Yes, time slowly dissolved mortar and cracked walls. But the real destruction, the destruction that matters most, came from human decisions to suppress, neglect, weaponize, and systematically misremember. Every empire that controlled Ani after its abandonment chose erasure over preservation, because preservation would have required acknowledging uncomfortable truths. This means that Ani's impermanence was not inevitable in the sense that earthquakes and erosion are inevitable. The ruins could have been maintained. The churches could have been preserved. The memory could have been transmitted accurately across generations. That this did not happen reflects not the limits of stone and mortar, not the impossibility of resisting natural decay, but the limits of human willingness to remember things that complicate preferred narratives about the present. We choose which memories to preserve and which to let decay. These choices reveal what we value more than truth: simplicity over complexity, certainty over ambiguity, narratives that support current power structures over narratives that challenge them. Ani was allowed to decay, its memory distorted, because an accurate account of what it was and what it represented would threaten nationalist mythologies that require ethnic homogeneity and exclusive territorial claims rooted in ancient occupation. Consider the modern parallels that make this pattern visible in our own time. Detroit, once the fourth largest American city and a symbol of industrial prosperity, automotive innovation, and middle-class aspiration, now features vast zones of abandonment where nature reclaims urban spaces with surprising speed. Entire neighborhoods have been demolished, leaving blocks of empty lots where houses once stood. The ruins of factories that employed tens of thousands now attract only urban explorers and photographers documenting decay, creating images that circulate online as examples of urban decline and American deindustrialization. The comparison to Ani is inexact. Detroit still has hundreds of thousands of residents, still functions as a city despite its decline, but the pattern is illuminating. Both cities thrived by serving specific economic functions within larger systems. Ani as a Silk Road trading hub, Detroit as the center of American automobile manufacturing. Both declined when those systems shifted, trade routes moving to more convenient locations, manufacturing moving to lower-wage regions. Both became politically inconvenient to remember accurately and completely, easier to let decay or to tell simplified stories about than to preserve as evidence of alternative ways of organizing economic and social life. Detroit's ruins suggest that the market-based, automobile-centered model of 20th-century American prosperity might not be sustainable. They raise questions about whether the suburban sprawl built around automotive transportation can survive the transition to whatever comes after: cheap oil and unconstrained carbon emissions. These are uncomfortable questions for a political culture invested in the American dream narrative. Easier to let Detroit decay, to tell stories about corrupt government and union demands, than to preserve it properly as evidence that the entire model might have inherent contradictions. Or consider Pripyat, the Soviet-planned city built to house workers at the Chernobyl nuclear plant, evacuated in April 1986 and frozen in time as radiation made permanent habitation impossible. The city represents another kind of failure, technological hubris, rather than political miscalculation or economic transformation. But the pattern is similar. A place built with confidence in permanence, designed according to Soviet planning principles that promised rational mastery of nature and society, abandoned when the assumptions underlying that confidence proved catastrophically false. The Ferris wheel that never opened because the accident happened days before the May Day festival where it was to debut. The school desks still holding books, abandoned mid-lesson when teachers received evacuation orders. The apartments still furnished as if residents might return tomorrow. Personal belongings visible through windows in buildings too radioactive to safely enter. All of it documenting the gap between intentions and outcomes, between what we build expecting to last and what actually endures, between human confidence in our ability to control nature and nature's indifference to our plans. Climate change promises to add scores of coastal cities to this catalog of modern ruins over the coming century. Miami, Venice, Bangkok, Shanghai, Mumbai, Lake Assal face eventual inundation as sea levels rise from thermal expansion and ice sheet melt. Engineers propose increasingly elaborate systems of barriers and pumps. Billions are invested in protecting infrastructure built in locations chosen when sea level stability could be assumed. But the physics are implacable, the chemistry unchangeable. The water is coming, however slowly, however much we wish otherwise. At some point, probably within the lifetimes of people already born, the cost of defending these cities will exceed the value of what is being defended. Evacuation will begin, first, as a trickle of those with resources to relocate. Then as a flood when governments finally acknowledge the inevitable and organize managed retreat. Future generations will explore drowned cities the way we explore Anna's Plateau, diving through flooded streets, marveling at the ambition of building major urban centers in places that are now underwater, wondering why the builders did not simply choose higher ground or at least plan for the possibility of having to relocate. The lesson writes itself across these examples, ancient and modern. Cities are temporary. Civilizations are fragile. Nothing lasts, no matter how solid it seems in the moment. But this lesson is precisely what humans seem constitutionally unable to internalize in any way that changes behavior. We know intellectually that impermanence is the nature of all conditioned things, as the Buddhist formulation elegantly expresses it. We can recite poetry about the transience of human works, can appreciate the irony of Ozymandias commanding future generations to look upon his works and despair when nothing remains but fragments in the desert. But we continue building as if we had not learned anything, as if our civilization will somehow be the exception to the pattern, as if our monuments will somehow defeat time when all previous attempts have failed. We continue investing in permanence, even while knowing intellectually that permanence is impossible. This is not ignorance in the simple sense of not knowing. This is something deeper: psychological denial, civilizational refusal to accept what we know to be true. Perhaps this is not entirely foolish. Perhaps there is wisdom in this denial that transcends the futility of the specific projects. Perhaps the value of building monuments lies not in their permanence, which is always temporary despite intentions, but in the building itself, in the process, rather than the product. The creation of something larger than individual human scale. Something that requires cooperation and shared vision and collective effort. Something that transforms abstract intention into physical reality. Perhaps this process matters more than whether the resulting structure ultimately lasts. The builders of Anna's churches knew they would die. They knew their individual bodies would decay, that their names might be forgotten, that the specific details of their lives would dissolve into the general anonymity that claims most humans, but they participated in something that transcended their individual deaths, something that connected them to past and future through shared effort and shared faith. They were part of a project larger than themselves, a civilization-building endeavor that gave their lives meaning beyond mere biological survival and reproduction. The fact that their names are now forgotten, that the meanings they attach to their work have been lost or distorted, does not necessarily erase the meaning they found in the building itself. In the daily work of quarrying stone and mixing mortar and raising walls toward the sky, the monuments failed to preserve their memory, yes. But while they lived, while they built, they were engaged in meaningful activity that connected them to something larger than individual existence. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps meaning does not require permanent outcomes, does not depend on being remembered forever. Or perhaps there is value in the ruins themselves, in the way they make visible processes normally too slow to perceive, in what they teach about time and impermanence and the relationship between human ambition and natural process. A perfectly preserved building, maintained exactly as built through constant intervention, teaches us nothing about impermanence, because the impermanence is hidden behind preservation work. But a ruin, crumbling slowly back into the earth, reveals time made visible, change made tangible, dissolution made aesthetic. It demonstrates that everything returns to its constituent elements eventually, that the stone goes back to earth through the slow alchemy of freeze-thaw cycles and chemical weathering, that human works dissolve into the landscape from which they emerged, that the boundary between human construction and natural world is temporary and permeable. Ruins teach impermanence in a way that new buildings and preserved monuments cannot, making visible the processes that new construction denies and preservation arrests. There is a kind of beauty in this, if you can see it without grief. If you can look at Annie's crumbling walls and empty churches and grass-filled streets without mourning what was lost. The wildflowers blooming in what were once royal chambers, the birds nesting in bell towers that will never ring again, the grass growing through cracked pavement, its roots slowly prying apart stones fitted by master masons 1,000 years ago, the vines climbing walls, finding purchase in joints and cracks, eventually pulling down what siege engines and earthquakes could not topple. Nature is not hostile to these abandoned places. It does not attack them with malicious intent. It simply reclaims them through patient operation of physical and chemical processes that preceded human presence and will continue after every trace of Ani has vanished. In another 1,000 years, absent active preservation, Ani will be visible only as irregularities in the contour of the plateau. Slight elevations and depressions hinting at buried foundations that archaeological surveys might detect but casual visitors would miss. The grass will have won its slow victory. This is what preservation prevents. By freezing ruins in their current state, we stop the natural processes that would eventually erase them. We arrest decay at a particular moment and insist through constant intervention that this moment be maintained indefinitely. We fill cracks with mortar, replace eroded stones, install drainage to prevent water damage, erect barriers to protect against wind and weather. But in doing so, we prevent the ruins from teaching their final lesson, that everything passes, that impermanence extends to the monuments we build to deny impermanence, that the proper response to this truth is not frantic preservation but acceptance. The modern impulse to preserve, catalog, and interpret every ruin reflects our deep discomfort with endings, with irreversible loss, with the idea that some knowledge and some structures will simply cease to exist. We want definitive conclusions, clear lessons, meanings that persist across time. We want to know what things meant when they were built and to preserve that meaning unchanged. We treat every lost building or forgotten story as a tragedy, a failure of cultural memory that proper preservation could have prevented. But ruins resist such clarity through their very nature. They exist in a state between presence and absence, between memory and forgetting, between meaning and dissolution. Every interpretation we impose on them says more about our current concerns, our present anxieties, our contemporary political needs, than about the actual past they represent. We see in ruins what we need to see, what our particular moment requires us to find there, what serves our arguments and validates our positions. For the Victorian archaeologists who first documented Ani systematically in the late 19th century, the ruins represented the triumph and fragility of Christian civilization, evidence of a glorious past destroyed by Muslim conquest. This interpretation perfectly matched British imperial ideology about the need to protect Christian minorities throughout the Ottoman Empire, the civilizing mission of European powers in the Near East, the superiority of Christian civilization even in defeat. They photographed churches, measured domes, copied inscriptions, and published illustrated volumes that presented Ani as martyred Christendom preserved in stone. For Soviet Armenians in the 20th century, the same ruins represented homeland and loss, tangible evidence of the civilization from which they had been displaced, validation of national identity through emphasis on ancient achievement and modern victimization. The precise architectural details mattered less than the symbolic weight of this city across the closed border, this forbidden homeland that Soviet citizens could never visit, but that anchored Armenian identity in a specific geographical location with deep historical roots. For Turkish nationalists, the ruins demonstrate rightful conquest and continuity, proof that Eastern Anatolia was won through military prowess in the 11th century and has been Turkish territory ever since. That Armenian claims represent irredentism and historical revisionism rather than legitimate grievance. The Seljuk conquest is emphasized. The 8 centuries of Armenian civilization before that conquest minimized or presented as merely one phase in a longer history of many peoples passing through the region. For UNESCO and the international preservation community, the ruins represent universal heritage transcending national claims, a masterpiece of medieval architecture that belongs to all humanity rather than to any particular nation or ethnic group. This perspective offers the promise of neutral professionalism. But in practice, the neutrality is impossible to maintain because preservation requires interpretation, and interpretation requires taking positions on whose heritage is being preserved and why it matters. Each interpretation is true from its own perspective and false from every other. There is no neutral ground, no view from nowhere that transcends the political and psychological needs that drive our engagement with the past. Perhaps the deepest truth about Ani is that there is no single truth about Ani, no definitive interpretation that captures its complete meaning, no way to see the ruins except through the lens of our own concerns and contexts. The actual historical city, the place where real people lived and worked and built and died, becomes less accessible with every interpretation we layer on top of it. Each story we tell, each meaning we assign, each political purpose the ruins are made to serve buries the actual past a little deeper, beneath the accumulated weight of present concerns. This is the paradox of preservation. The more effort we invest in preserving and interpreting Ani, the less access we have to what Ani actually was. Because preservation requires narratives, and narratives require simplification, and simplification requires erasing the complexity that made the city historically significant. So perhaps the real question is not how to preserve Ani, but whether to preserve it at all. What if we simply let nature take its course? Let the walls collapse as freeze-thaw cycles eventually crack every stone. Let the grass advance year by year. Let the stones slowly weather back into the plateau from which they were quarried, completing the cycle that began when the first foundations were laid. This would mean accepting that some knowledge is irretrievably lost, that future generations will not have access to evidence we still possess, that the physical link to this particular past will be severed. But it would also mean accepting impermanence, not as tragedy, but as natural process, refusing the impulse to freeze time at a moment of our choosing, acknowledging that everything returns to dust, and that our monuments are no exception, however much we wish otherwise. It would mean releasing Ani from its role as political symbol and archaeological site and tourist destination, allowing it to simply be ruins, simply be matter, slowly changing state, simply be earth receiving back what was briefly borrowed and briefly transformed into churches and walls and streets. This will not happen, of course. Too many political interests are invested in Anna's preservation and interpretation for such radical acceptance to be possible. The ruins are too valuable as symbols to be allowed to simply disappear. Turkey needs them to demonstrate cultural tolerance and attract tourism revenue. Armenia needs them to anchor claims about the homeland and the genocide. UNESCO needs them as an example of successful heritage diplomacy. Archaeologists need them as research sites. Each group has reasons to prevent natural dissolution, to maintain the ruins in something approximating their current state indefinitely. And perhaps there is wisdom in this resistance as well. Perhaps the right relationship with ruins is neither total preservation that arrests all change, nor complete acceptance of dissolution that abandons intervention. Perhaps what is needed is something between these extremes, maintaining enough structure that future generations can encounter these places, can experience some connection, however mediated, to the people who built them, while acknowledging that what they encounter will be shaped as much by time and interpretation as by original intention. The wind continues moving through Annie's empty churches, constant and indifferent to our arguments about preservation and interpretation. The grass continues its patient advance through cracks in the pavement, its roots working into joints and slowly prying stones apart. The stones continue their gradual dissolution into soil through chemical weathering and physical erosion, participating in geological cycles that operate on timescales that make human history look like a moment's fluctuation. These processes operated before humans arrived on this plateau and will continue operating after every trace of Ani has vanished. After the interpretations and arguments and preservation efforts have all been forgotten, they do not care about our interpretations or our preservation efforts or our need for monuments to provide meaning and continuity. They simply continue, patient and inexorable, dissolving form back into formlessness, resolving complex structures into simpler constituents, returning everything to the earth from which it came. And perhaps this indifference is the final lesson, the teaching that makes all the other lessons possible. The universe does not care whether we remember or forget Ani, whether we preserve its ruins or let them dissolve, whether we tell accurate stories about what happened there or convenient fictions that serve present needs. These are human concerns, meaningful only within the brief span of human consciousness, mattering only to the tiny fraction of matter that has temporarily organized itself into beings capable of caring about such things. From the perspective of geological time, Anna's entire existence, its rise from a fortified settlement to a cosmopolitan capital, its flourishing as a trading hub, its decline and abandonment, its afterlife as ruin and symbol, its eventual preservation or dissolution is a momentary fluctuation, a brief arrangement of matter that will resolve back into constituent elements as surely as a wave returns to the ocean. 1,000 years is nothing. 10,000 years is nothing. Eventually, even the plateau will erode. The rivers will change course. The landscape itself will be transformed beyond recognition. This could be nihilistic, a revelation that nothing matters because everything ends, that human achievements are meaningless against the scale of cosmic time. But it could also be liberating, a release from the burden of needing permanence, from the anxiety that drives us to build monuments and preserve ruins and fight over the interpretation of the past. If nothing lasts anyway, if all monuments eventually fail, if every civilization joins the ruins of civilizations past, then perhaps the meaning is not in lasting, but in the living, not in the permanence of outcomes, but in the richness of the process. The value of Ani was not that it would endure forever. That was never possible, despite what its builders believed. The value was that it existed at all, that for a few centuries people created something remarkable in a challenging environment, that traders met and bargained and built trust across cultural boundaries, that churches rose toward the sky and light flooded through carefully calculated windows, that life happened in its full complexity and contradiction and occasional glory. The builders of Ani were not wrong to build even though their city was temporary. They were wrong only in believing that permanence was possible, that their monuments would defeat time, that their names and achievements would be remembered forever. The monuments failed as vessels of memory, but the living was real. The commerce was real. The churches were real in the moment of their construction and use, even though they are ruins now, even though their meanings have been lost or distorted beyond recognition. Meaning does not require permanence. Significance does not depend on duration. A moment can matter even if it does not last, can be precious, even if it is transient, can be beautiful, even while it is already passing away. This is hard wisdom to accept in a culture obsessed with legacy and lasting impact, with measuring significance by duration, with assuming that things which last longer matter more. But Ani, in its ruin, suggests otherwise. Its most significant period was not when it built monuments intended to last forever, but when it functioned as a commercial hub, creating value through service and neutrality. Its churches are impressive as engineering and art, worthy of preservation and study. But its real contribution to human possibility was creating a neutral space where exchange could happen across ethnic and religious lines, where rigid identities mattered less than commercial reliability, where cosmopolitan mixing generated prosperity that benefited people from many backgrounds. That function was temporary, dependent on specific geopolitical circumstances that did not last. It ended when those circumstances changed, when the space for neutrality contracted, when empires demanded exclusive allegiance. But it was real and significant while it lasted, even though it did not last, even though it left almost no physical trace except the churches that were symptoms rather than causes of the prosperity they represented. Perhaps this is the final reframe, the ultimate contrarian perspective on Ani that completes the journey this narrative has traced. The city is remembered for its churches, for the stone monuments that partially survived and can be photographed and measured and visited. But it should be remembered for its markets, for the institutional frameworks and commercial networks that left almost no physical trace, for the trust and reliability and pragmatic tolerance that made exchange possible across boundaries that seem insurmountable in more rigid social orders. The things that lasted, churches, walls, foundations, were not the things that mattered most. The things that mattered most, neutral spaces, cosmopolitan social systems, commercial sophistication, were the first to disappear and the hardest to preserve because they existed in relationships and institutions rather than in stone. We memorialize what is easy to memorialize, solid objects rather than fluid systems, monuments rather than practices, individuals rather than institutions, buildings rather than the social arrangements that made the buildings possible. But this means our history is systematically biased toward what survived rather than what mattered, toward the durable rather than the significant. Ani's churches tell us about royal ambition and religious devotion, about engineering techniques and artistic achievement. These are worthy topics, important aspects of the historical record. But to understand what made Ani significant in its own time, what lessons it might offer for our own, we need to imagine the things that left no trace, the conversations in market stalls, the negotiations in currency exchanges, the contracts written in languages nobody speaks anymore, the trust slowly built between merchants from different cultures, the thousand small decisions and social practices that made commerce function across barriers that seem natural and insurmountable from our present perspective. All of that is gone now, accessible only through fragmentary written records that provide hints and outlines, but cannot resurrect the lived reality, cannot make us feel what it was like to be a Persian merchant entering Ana's markets, or an Armenian currency exchanger calculating exchange rates, or a Byzantine merchant negotiating a contract through translators. The churches remain, or their ruins remain, substantial enough to photograph and study. And so we tell stories about a religious city, about Armenian Christian civilization, about architectural achievement. But Ani was fundamentally a commercial city that built churches with its profits, a trading hub that used religious architecture to legitimize a social order based on commercial exchange. Getting this backwards, remembering the symptom rather than the cause, is exactly the kind of mistake that happens when we privilege what survives over what mattered, when we let the biases of preservation determine our understanding of the past. So let the wind blow through the empty churches one final time as this story approaches its close. Let the stones continue their slow collapse toward the earth. Let future generations make of these ruins whatever meanings serve their needs, knowing that those meanings will be as temporary as the city itself, as fleeting as the civilizations that rose and fell and rose again in this region over millennia. There is peace in this acceptance, a kind of rest that comes from stopping the struggle to impose permanence on an impermanent world, from releasing the need for monuments to last forever, from acknowledging that everything passes and that passing is not tragedy but simply the nature of existence. And let yourself drift now as the story of Ani drifts into the silence from which it briefly emerged. The city is sleeping its final sleep, beyond dreams, beyond memory, dissolving into the earth. The empire that built it is sleeping. The empires that destroyed it are sleeping. Even the conflicts over its memory are quieting as participants die and younger generations find other symbols to contest, other battles to fight, other meanings to construct from the fragments of the past. Everything sleeps eventually, even the restlessness of human ambition, even the denial of impermanence, even the need to build monuments and preserve ruins and tell definitive stories about what everything meant. All of it quiets, all of it rests, all of it returns to silence. The grass grows, patient and unstoppable. The wind blows, carrying away even the dust of stones that seemed eternal. The plateau rests under sun and stars, holding the memory of the city the way the earth holds all memories, not as story or symbol, but as matter, slowly changing state. As atoms rearranged by life briefly and returned to simpler configurations after, and somewhere in the distance, barely audible, if you listen with more than ears, the echo of caravans that will never arrive, of bells that will never ring again, of languages spoken by no living tongue, not quite memory, not quite forgetting, just the soft insistence of a city that once was, dissolving slowly into the earth, becoming part of the plateau, becoming wind and grass and stone, becoming what it always was underneath the brief human arrangement, just matter, just time, just the world continuing its ancient patterns, indifferent to the meanings we impose and the monuments we build and the stories we tell ourselves about permanence. Sleep now, let it all go. The empire, the churches, the forgetting, the remembering, the preservation, the interpretation. Let the wind carry it away. Let the grass reclaim it. Let time do what time does, patient and unstoppable and finally merciful in its willingness to erase everything, to resolve all complexity back into simplicity, to return everything to the silence and stillness from which it briefly emerged. Nothing lasts, everything changes. This too shall pass. And in that passing, if we can see it rightly, there is not tragedy but simply truth, the world as it actually is, stripped of the stories we tell to deny what we already know in our bones, in our cells, in the quiet moments when we stop resisting and simply allow things to be what they are, impermanent, precious because impermanent, beautiful because already passing, already gone. Rest now in that knowledge. rest in the ruins. Rest in the grass and the wind and the stones, warming in the sun that shone on this plateau before Ani and will shine hereafter. Every trace has vanished. Rest in Ani, the city of 1001 churches, frozen in silence. Finally at peace with its own dissolution, finally released from the impossible burden of permanence. Finally just what it always was, beneath the ambition and the building and the hoping. A temporary arrangement of matter and meaning, beautiful while it lasted, gone now, leaving only traces for the wind to scatter, and the grass to cover, and time to erase, until even the traces are forgotten, and the plateau is simply plateau again, empty and windswept, holding no memory of the lives lived here, or the monuments built here, or the stories told about what happened here. Just stone, just earth, just time, just sleep.